From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
He's openly racist, fascist. He says, for example, that he talks about raping women openly. He said that he'd rather have a dead son than a gay son. So he says outrageous things very openly, and that's very dangerous.
In Brazil, a far-right former army officer who praises dictatorships is moving closer to becoming the next president of the world's fourth-largest democracy. We'll look at the rise of Jair Bolsonaro and what it means for Latin America. Then, as the monster Hurricane Michael gains strength as it barrels toward the Florida Panhandle, a major new United Nations climate report warns humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe. We'll speak with climate scientist Kevin Anderson in Manchester, England. And following Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's latest meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, we'll speak with Beatrice Finn of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
And right now we see evidence that deterrence and using nuclear weapons to protect ourselves is not working. It does not create stability and peace in the region. Rather, it escalates tensions. It fuels the crisis and leads us at risk for nuclear war.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Central America, at least 13 people have died after torrential downpours from Hurricane Michael hit Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, causing major flooding and landslides. The monster hurricane is expected to make landfall in the Florida Panhandle as a Category 3 storm Wednesday, with Florida Governor Rick Scott declaring a state of emergency in 35 counties, and Alabama Governor Kay Ivey declaring a state of emergency for the whole state. This is Governor Scott.
Storm surge, rain, floods. We can see tornadoes. So you got to follow the weather. You got to listen when they say they're to evacuate. You have got to evacuate, and don't wait to the last minute because this is different than a lot of the storms that we've seen since I've been governor. It's fast.
The hurricane's approach came as President Trump visited Florida ahead of the storm Monday. He made no mention of climate change or the UN landmark report that humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe. We'll have more on the climate report later in the broadcast. President Trump hosted a ceremonial swearing-in of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh Monday evening, declaring victory in the contentious fight to confirm a man accused by multiple women of sexual misconduct. Trump's apology came hours after he told reporters that accusations against Kavanaugh by Christine Blasey Ford, Deborah Ramirez, and Julie Swetnick were, quote, a hoax set up by the Democrats.
On behalf of our nation, I want to apologize to Brett and the entire Kavanaugh family for the terrible pain and suffering you have been forced to endure. Those who step forward to serve our country deserve a fair and dignified evaluation, not a campaign of political and personal destruction based on lies and deception.
President Trump falsely claimed Kavanaugh had been proven innocent during his confirmation process. Monday evening's unprecedented White House ceremony brought together all 9 Supreme Court justices and Republican leaders in the East Room of the White House. The room burst into applause after Trump ordered a standing ovation for Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell for his role in speeding Kavanaugh's confirmation through the Senate. Among those applauding was Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who was confirmed in 1991 despite testimony by Anita Hill that Thomas repeatedly sexually harassed her when he was her boss. Meanwhile, attorney Deborah Katz said Dr. Christine Blasey Ford is still living in hiding after her Senate testimony last month amidst what Katz called unending death threats. In China, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with his counterpart amidst tense relations and an escalating trade war between the two countries. The talks were marked by a decidedly hostile tone, with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi saying, quote, "We believe China and the U.S. should stick to the correct path of cooperation and win-win rather than be mired in a wrong path full of conflicts and confrontations." Both President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence have publicly accused China of interfering in the U.S. elections. The president of Interpol, Meng Hongwei, has stepped down from the International Police Cooperation Agency after being accused of corruption and detained by Chinese authorities. Meng reportedly went missing after he recently flew from France, where Interpol is headquartered, to visit China, where he's a citizen. Disgraced former Trump campaign official Rick Gates solicited proposals from an Israeli psychological operations firm to manipulate social media in Trump's favor and to gather intelligence on Trump's opponents during the 2016 election season. That's according to an expose in the New York Times, which reports Gates contacted Psy Group, a company staffed by former Israeli intelligence agents seeking ways to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign. Psy Group also proposed using thousands of phony social media accounts to target delegates to the Republican National Convention in order to prevent them from rebelling against Trump. The Times reports Psy Group's owner pitched the proposals at a 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr., United Arab Emirates advisor George Nader, and Eric Prince, the founder of the mercenary company Blackwater. The Times reports there's no evidence Gates acted on Psy Group's proposals. Last year, Rick Gates and his boss, Paul Manafort, were indicted by special counsel Robert Mueller's team on multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. Gates pleaded guilty to many of the charges. In Turkey, authorities are searching for a black van seen leaving the Saudi consulate in Istanbul as they investigate the case of disappeared Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. On Monday, The Washington Post published a photo taken from a CCTV camera at the consulate that is believed to be the last known image of Khashoggi before his disappearance last Tuesday, when he entered the Saudi consulate to obtain papers related to his upcoming marriage. In tech news, the Wall Street Journal is reporting Google will shut down its social network Google+ after revelations of a data breach that exposed the private data of hundreds of thousands of users. The breach was discovered in March but was not disclosed to the public. An internal Google memo showed executives were worried they'd face new government regulations if news of the data breach got out. The scandal follows news last month of a major data breach at Facebook, which saw the personal information of nearly 50 million users exposed after an online attack. In New York City, family and friends of Fausto Luna held a vigil Sunday to mourn the death of the longtime Uber driver who died by suicide as he struggled to make ends meet. Luna began driving with Uber in 2013. His family said he was suffering from depression as his debts mounted. Luna is the 7th New York City driver and the first from an app-based ride-hailing service to die by suicide within the last year. The New York Taxi Workers Alliance issued a statement in solidarity with Luna and his family, writing, quote, "Every city needs to take a deeper look at what happens when you let Wall Street-backed corporations use billions of dollars in capital to lock workers into a prison of poverty." New York State officials say a limousine involved in one of the deadliest crashes in decades in the United States in the town of Schoharie Saturday had failed an inspection last month and was not licensed to be on the road. The crash killed 17 passengers, as well as the limo's driver and 2 pedestrians. It was the deadliest U.S. transportation disaster since 2009. New York State officials are investigating the owner of the company, Prestige Limousine Chauffeur Service, a Pakistani immigrant named Malik Shahid Hussain. In 2001, Hussain was arrested for helping people cheat on driver's license tests. In exchange for avoiding deportation, he took a job as an FBI confidential informant, posing as a radical arms dealer in FBI sting operations. Hussain was a key figure in the FBI's case against the so-called Newburgh Four Muslim men sentenced to 25-year prison terms after they were convicted for placing what they thought were bombs in a New York synagogue in 2010. Defense attorneys say the men were entrapped by government agents. Hussain's backstory emerged as New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said he may face criminal charges for the crash.
We inspected the vehicle just last month. It failed the inspection. The driver did not have the appropriate license. So I think the owner of this company, the owner of Prestige, has a lot of questions to answer. There's an ongoing investigation. But is there a possibility of liability, civil and criminal? Certainly.
Governor Cuomo spoke as he marched in a parade honoring the 15th century Italian mercenary and explorer Christopher Columbus, who massacred and enslaved Arawak indigenous people while opening the door to the European colonization of the Americas. On Monday, Cuomo nominated a statue of Christopher Columbus near Manhattan's Central Park to the National Register of Historic Places. President Donald Trump also marked Monday's holiday, tweeting, quote, "Christopher Columbus's spirit of determination and adventure has provided inspiration to generations of Americans. On Columbus Day, we honor his remarkable accomplishments as a navigator and celebrate his voyage into the unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean," unquote. Trump's tweet came as an increasing number of cities have rejected the Columbus Day holiday. Columbus, Ohio, the state's capital city, remained open for business on Monday, opting instead to close for Veterans Day this year. In Los Angeles, officials marked Indigenous Peoples Day for the first time this year, as Native American tribal leaders held a ceremony marking the occasion. This is Chief Redblood of Gabrielino Tongva tribe in California.
It's something that it's been instilled in us since in school, that in 1492 Columbus was this great guy, was an explorer, was an adventurer, was going to be, that was going to be a good person to us. But as we got older, we learned otherwise, that it wasn't true. And now, I guess you could say the truth is out.
In Minnesota, water protectors opposing the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline say they've erected a traditional Ojibwe structure directly in the path of the proposed line, which would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Superior, Wisconsin. In a statement, the group Anti-Colonial Land Defense said its Indigenous Peoples Day action was aimed at stopping, quote, serious threats to our water, land and air in conjunction with trespassing on Indigenous land, unquote. Elsewhere in Minnesota, a trial began Monday for 3 activists who face felony charges for their civil disobedience action in 2016 when they manually turned off a pair of Enbridge tar sands pipelines. The so-called valve turners, Annette Clapstein and Emily Nesbitt Johnston, along with a support person, Benjamin Joldersma, are mounting a necessity defense, saying their civil disobedience was justified by the urgent need to stop climate change. But on Monday, a Minnesota district court judge ruled expert witnesses, including 350.org founder Bill McKibben and former top NASA climate scientist Dr. James Hansen, will not be allowed to testify on their behalf. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has awarded this year's Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics to Yale University's William Nordhaus and New York University's Paul Romer for their work on adapting environmental models to fit models of economic growth. Speaking from Yale's campus Monday, Professor Nordhaus said the U.S. would come to accept the science of climate change after President Trump leaves office.
This administration won't last forever. I think I think it's really anomalous in the United States, this degree of hostility to environmental policy and climate change policy. So all I can do is hope that we'll get through this without too much damage.
And in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University announced plans to name a new research building after Henrietta Lacks, a former patient of the university hospital who's become known for her immortal cells. Lacks, an African-American woman, was a patient at Johns Hopkins University in 1951. While receiving treatment for cancer, researchers collected her cells, which were used to create HeLa cells, a strain of self-replicating cells that have led to numerous advances in medicine, including the development of polio vaccine. She died later that year. In recent years, her family has spoken out about the university's use of Lacks cells, which were taken without her consent or knowledge, raising questions about privacy and patients' rights, as well as whether the family should receive compensation for their use. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Brazil, where a far-right former army officer is moving closer to becoming the next president of the world's 4th largest democracy. On Sunday, Jair Bolsonaro won 46% of the vote in a far more decisive victory than was expected. Because he didn't hit 50%, he'll now face Fernando Haddad of the leftist Workers' Party in a runoff on October 28th. Haddad won 29% of the vote Sunday. Many critics of Bolsonaro warn the future of democracy in Brazil is now at risk. Bolsonaro has openly praised Brazil's military dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 85. He also has a long history of making racist, homophobic and misogynistic comments, once telling a female lawmaker she was too ugly to rape. He's encouraged police to kill suspected drug dealers. In April, he was actually charged with hate speech over his tirades. But Bolsonaro's popularity has soared in recent weeks after he was stabbed while out on the campaign trail. On Sunday, he briefly spoke after casting his vote.
All of this has brought and awoken the people to the idea that Brazil can't continue on the path to socialism. We don't want to be tomorrow what Venezuela is today.
On Sunday, Jair Bolsonaro's Social Liberal Party won unexpected victories across Brazil. In Brazil's lower house, Bolsonaro's party won 52 seats, up from just 8. It's now the second largest party in the chamber. Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, received more votes than any congressional candidate in Brazil's history. Meanwhile, Brazilian voters ousted a stunning 2/3 of incumbents Sunday. Jair Bolsonaro also directly benefited from the jailing of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who had been leading all presidential polls earlier this year. Lula has been in jail since April on what many consider trumped-up corruption charges. His hand-picked successor, former Sao Paulo Mayor Fernando Haddad, now faces an uphill fight against Bolsonaro in the October 28th runoff. On Monday, Haddad traveled to meet with Lula in his cell and discuss strategy. Afterwards, he said he was ready for the next round of voting.
We're very excited for the second round because the second round offers an opportunity that we didn't have in the first round to debate the projects that each one of the remaining candidates advocate for the country. We'll have an important opportunity to compare these two projects so that voters have an opportunity, in my opinion, that they didn't have in the first round of comparison.
Meanwhile, the Workers' Party suffered major defeats in legislative races. Former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff lost her bid for a Brazilian Senate seat, winning just 15% of the vote. We're joined right now by Maria Luisa Mendonça. She's director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, joining us in our New York studio. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about what took place on Sunday and the significance of Bolsonaro's not outright victory? He still has the runoff, but he got many more votes than was expected.
Yes, that's a very dangerous situation in Brazil that I think is very important to monitor because that could have an impact in the whole region. Like you said before, former President Lula, actually, if he was able to run, he would probably win very easily. But there was a vacuum created because he was put in jail with charges of receiving a bribe, but actually there is no evidence that he received the bribe. So since the parliamentary coup against President Dilma Rousseff 2 years ago, we are in the situation of a limbo. We cannot consider that we have a democracy in Brazil right now. And so Bolsonaro is the result of a series of attacks on democracy that started 2 years ago with the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff.
So Dilma Rousseff is couped out. She is forced out of the presidency. And then Lula, who decided to run for president, is imprisoned.
Exactly. Yeah, we said that there was a coup because there was no evidence that she committed any crimes, but she was impeached anyway. And Bolsonaro at that time voted, as a Congress member, voted for the impeachment in the name of the person who tortured her during the military dictatorship when she was in prison.
What do you mean he ordered the he supported the impeachment in his honor?
Yes, because during the vote in Congress, most Congress members voted in the name of the God, in the name of their family, and Bolsonaro voted in the name of the person who tortured Dilma during the military dictatorship.
I want to go to Dilma Rousseff. I interviewed her in April here. She was ousted in 2016 in what she's described as a coup, and I asked her about the rise of the far right.
Posso sim. De fato.
Yes, I can indeed. The far right in Brazil, like the far right everywhere, is anti-woman, anti-black, anti-indigenous persons, and it is in favor of ending all oversight. And they struggled for this. They want to end any oversight of labor work situations analogous to slavery that continue to exist in Brazil. They are full of prejudice and intolerance, and they believe that they can resolve the most complex problems using brute force of violence, open violence. What happened in the vote in the impeachment process that I suffered, well, legislator Bolsonaro cast his vote paying tribute to the military dictatorship and torture, and the torturer whose name was Carlos Alberto Prihante Ultra, in casting his vote, he paid tribute to this man who was a torturer in Sao Paulo, and he was recognized in all of the processes of truth and justice that unfolded in Brazil. He said the following to pay tribute to someone who brought terror to President Dilma Rousseff, a person who is capable during an impeachment proceeding to justify his vote in this manner is a person who sows hatred. He spreads hatred because he only understands one language, the language of violence.
And that's Dilma Rousseff, the former Brazilian president who was impeached. I was speaking to her when she was at the University of California, Berkeley. Maria Luisa Mendonça, she describes Bolsonaro. If you can talk more about Bolsonaro's history and what exactly he represents.
Yeah, he represents the sector of the military that is openly fascist. Like you said before, he talks about raping women openly. He said that he'd rather have a dead son than a gay son. He praises the military dictatorship. He said that he would give the police should be free to kill. So it's a very...
Let me go to him in his own words.
Okay.
2013 interview with he was Congressman Jair Bolsonaro on BBC.
I went into battle with the gays because the government proposed anti-homophobia classes for the junior grades. But that would actively stimulate homosexuality in children from 6 years old. This is not normal. Your culture is different to ours. We're not ready for all of this in Brazil, because no father would ever take pride in having a gay son. Pride, happiness, celebrate if his son turns out gay? No way.
That's Jair Bolsonaro, the front runner in Brazil, also, as you said, told a congresswoman she was too ugly to rape.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, what happens now also is there is a lot of media manipulation. Since the impeachment of President Dilma 2 years ago, there is constant attacks on the PT, on the Workers' Party. It was almost like all mainstream media in Brazil is like Fox News. There is no alternative. And also now during the campaign, Bolsonaro started a campaign of fake news, especially on WhatsApp, that is not controlled. For example, Facebook has closed several accounts that were spreading fake news against Fernando Haddad and against the candidate for vice president, Manuela. Also Steve Bannon is one of the advisors for Bolsonaro. So there is a lot of misinformation and manipulation.
In August, Jair Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, posted a photo on Twitter of him with former Trump strategist Steve Bannon. Eduardo Bolsonaro wrote, quote, "It was a pleasure to meet Steve Bannon, strategist in Donald Trump's presidential campaign. We had a great conversation and we shared the same worldview, and we're certainly in touch to join forces, especially against cultural Marxism." The significance of what Eduardo himself, Jair's son.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it's also important to understand that the media in Brazil is portraying Fernando Haddad, the progressive candidate, as far left. But when he was the mayor of São Paulo, actually what he did was He built several daycares and more than 30 hospitals, and he tried to make the traffic in the city better. For example, having infrastructure for bikes. When he was Ministry of Education under the Lula administration, he created more than 18 new federal universities, more than 300 new campuses, university campuses, and there was much more incentive and fellowships for education at all levels. So, you know, he comes from an educational background, and it's, you know, he doesn't come from any type of extreme left background. And so what we have now is a very extreme fascist candidate running against a moderate candidate that, and our hope now is that 3 other candidates, progressive candidates, have said that they would support Fernando Haddad now in the runoff elections in a few weeks. So hopefully, you know, between now and then, they will be able to...
Do you think that could make up the difference and then the runoff?
I think so, because those progressive candidates together will probably get about 20% of the votes, and if they are able to, you know, convince people that this is a dangerous path. And the challenge is how do we deal with media manipulation, not just mainstream media, but the manipulation on social media.
I wanted to go to Noam Chomsky, who just recently went to Brazil. He met with Lula in prison, and when he came out, Chomsky condemned Brazil's right-wing media.
We have just had the great privilege of spending an hour with Lula, and one of the points that he emphasized was that during his entire tenure in office, there was just a constant flood of attacks from all the media, constant, you know, thousands of attacks from every direction, which of course confuses and undermines public opinion. So the answer to your question is something is needed to counter the concentrated power of right-wing media, which particularly in Latin America just overwhelms everything.
So that's the world-renowned linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky. As we wrap up and leading into this runoff, the significance of the media in shaping popular opinion in Brazil.
Yeah, that's very important because during the administration of Dilma Rousseff, just an example, unemployment rate was 4%, and now it's 15%. So, of course, you know, there is an economic crisis, and but instead of looking at the future, that is the mainstream media plays this role of giving incentive to fear, and that creates the space for a fascist candidate like Bolsonaro. So the question is how because the left-wing parties already announced they're going to be united for the second round. The question is how the neoliberal parties, let's say the mainstream conservative parties that you know, are implementing structural adjustment policies, how, let's say, the mainstream conservative neoliberal parties would then what decision they're going to make, because it's a risky decision to support a far-right fascist candidate. So I think that's the main question.
Well, Maria Luisa Mendonça, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Manchester, England, to speak with Dr. Kevin Anderson about a new UN climate report as a monster hurricane bears down on the Panhandle in Florida. And the Alabama governor declares the whole state an emergency. Stay with us.
protetor das multidões, encarnações de célebres malandros, de cérebros brilhantes reuniram-se no céu, e o destino de um fiel seu, se é o que Deus quer, consumado, é o que é, assim foi escrito. Marte, um mito, um maldito sonhador, bandido da minha cor, um novo Messias. Se o povo dormia ou não, se poucos sabiam ler, iam morrer em vão, leste louco sem saber. Coisas do Brasil, super-herói mulato, defensor dos fracos, assaltante nato. Ouçam, é foto e é fato, há planos cruéis, tramam 30 fariseus contra Moisés, moro. Reaja ao revés, seja alvo de inveja, irmão. Esquinas revelam a sina de um rebelde, ó meu. Ousou lutar, amou a raça, honrou a causa que adotou, o aplauso é pra povo.
Thousand Faces of a Loyal Man by Hassionesis Semsis. And this is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. In Central America, at least 13 people have died after torrential downpours from Hurricane Michael hit Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, causing major flooding and landslides. The monster hurricane is expected to make landfall in the Florida Panhandle as a Category 3 storm Wednesday, with Florida Governor Rick Scott declaring a state of emergency in 35 counties, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey declaring a state of emergency for the entire state. Florida is preparing for the massive storm as a new report from the United Nations Climate Panel warns humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe. This is UN Meteorological Agency Chief Petteri Talas.
There's extreme urgency, and countries were giving their pledges after the Paris Agreement, and so far the progress hasn't been good enough that we would move towards 1.5 or 2 degrees target. So there's clearly a need for much higher ambition level to reach even 2 degrees target. So we are more moving towards 3 to 5 at the moment. There are some estimations what is the difference between 1.5 degree and 2 degree, and one of the major issues is that there would be 420 million people less suffering because of climate change if we would be able to limit the warming to 1.5 degree. Already the emissions that we have emitted to the atmosphere means that this negative trend will continue for the coming decades. So that's going to happen, and that means a growing amount of disasters and challenges related to climate change.
The IPCC report lays out several possible pathways to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, including transitions in land use and transportation systems and the adoption of future technologies, including removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. According to the report, global net carbon emissions would need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reach net zero around 2050. On Monday, President Trump traveled to Orlando, Florida, but made no mention of climate change or the new United Nations landmark report. Well, for more, we're joined by Kevin Anderson. He is professor of climate change leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. He's also chair of energy and climate change at Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester in Britain. Dr. Anderson, welcome back to Democracy Now! I wanted to ask you first about this report as this monster hurricane goes through Latin America and bears down on Florida and Alabama.
Well, the report makes very clear that between 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming and 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we will expect to see more extreme weather conditions, which indeed is why many of the poorer parts of the world asked the scientific community to actually investigate what are the actual differences between impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees. And of course, 2 degrees was the previous threshold that we were all apparently aiming for. But as has come out from the report, it's very clear that there are a whole suite of impacts that are much worse at 2 degrees centigrade than 1.5, and that these impacts will primarily hit poorer and more climate vulnerable communities around the world. So it's a very important report in terms of the impact, understanding the impacts of climate change, and making clear that we must aim really for 1.5 rather than 2 degrees. Though, as we probably discuss later, I think even 2 degrees is looking very hopeful now.
You write in your response to this landmark UN report that climate change is ultimately the responsibility of a few high emitters. Explain who they are.
Well, just to put some numbers on this, about half of global emissions arise from the activities of just about 10% of the world's population, and about 70% of all global emissions of carbon dioxide come from about 20% of the world's population. And very closely, the emissions relate to the wealth or the income of the citizens. So a professor like myself will be a relatively high emitter. Typically, professors live in large houses. They'll have a relatively large car. They'll travel quite often. Some of them I know would have second homes. They'll sometimes use business flights. They'll consume lots of goods. So it does correlate quite closely with income. So my concern here is that when we try to address climate change and reduce our emissions, by focusing on all 7.5 billion people, I think it misunderstands where the actual responsibility for the emissions reside, and therefore we're not developing policies that need to be tailored to that particular 20%. So many people listening to your show now in the US or elsewhere in the world will be medium to low emitters. And to them, yes, it's important they make some changes, but there will also be people listening to this show who are very high emitters. And it is those of us that really the policies need to aim at to drive the emissions out of our lifestyles. And we must make sure in doing that we don't impoverish people who already are struggling with the current economic system.
Who are the highest carbon emitters, Dr. Anderson?
The highest carbon emitters, well, they're going to be the very wealthiest in this world. From a climate point of view, when you hear the Al Gores and the DiCaprios talking about climate change, and you look at their carbon footprint, they'll be many thousands of times more than an average African, and many hundreds of times more probably even than many Americans. So it is that sort of, the very wealthy are the very high emitters, but also I think a professor like myself, senior lecturers in universities, the people who are more what we like to see as senior, the language we use, senior in our organizations, whether that's in companies or in the public or indeed the private sector, these people will be the high emitters. So, I won't make any comment on journalists, but certainly some of the journalists I'm familiar with, they are also very high emitters. So it is that upper echelons of society.
And in terms of countries?
Oh, in terms of countries, well, the biggest emitter now is China, followed by the US. But in both of those countries, of course, there's a big difference between the high emitters within that country and the low emitters within that country. So, the two big emitting countries, though, are the US and China, and then obviously shortly followed by the European Union.
So can you talk about what the U.S. is facing right now, this monster hurricane hitting the Panhandle? If you look at weather reports, and the networks are, at a time like this, increasingly take up more and more news time, are the weather reports, because whether we're talking about wildfires in California or these monster storms in the Carolinas and now possibly hitting Florida and Alabama. Alabama, the whole state has been called a state of emergency. There is almost no mention by meteorologists, and I'm not talking even Fox, I'm talking MSNBC and CNN, of the connection between these increasingly violent storms and climate change. Is there one, and can you explain it?
Well, there certainly is a connection. What we have done by putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is we've made the atmosphere warmer. In other words, we've put a lot more energy into the atmosphere. That energy will play out in terms of a whole suite of different, more extreme weather conditions. Now, whether this particular hurricane is caused by climate change is impossible to say. But what is often the case is that we are exacerbating or increasing the power in these hurricanes, in these extreme weather events. And this, what we call the fancy language of attribution, where we're trying to say, is this event a climate change event? We're getting better at understanding that. And certainly there's quite a lot of evidence now to suggest that some of the more recent severe weather conditions we've seen have been seriously exacerbated by the additional warming that we've put into the atmosphere from our burning of fossil fuels and the release of carbon dioxide. So whilst I can't comment on this particular hurricane and say this hurricane was caused by climate change, the severity of this hurricane and the severity of some of the other events that we've seen in recent years certainly has been exacerbated by issues of climate change, by our burning of fossil fuels. And the meteorologists should be making that clear link when they're discussing these issues during the weather forecasts within the US.
You talk about what's needed, Professor Anderson. The report says there's no documented historic precedent for the scale of changes required. You have talked about a Marshall Plan. What do you mean, a new Marshall Plan?
Well, the Marshall Plan was the deliberate strategy after the Second World War to try and reconstruct Europe after it had been obviously very severely bombed and destroyed, both institutionally but mostly physically during the war. So I'm saying that is probably the nearest metaphor or analogy we have to the scale of challenge that we actually face to decarbonise, to shift away from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a zero-carbon energy system, and to do that within the wealthy parts of the world, really within about 2 decades and probably 3 or 3.5 decades for the slightly poorer parts of the world. So we're not going to do that through small price mechanisms, through just tweaking the markets. It is going to require strategic intervention by governments to make the necessary rates of change. Now, that sounds initially sort of very challenging, and certainly it will be. But I think there is also there is a positive narrative behind this, in that this transition, this transformation to a zero-carbon energy system will come with lots of job opportunities, long-term secure job opportunities, not just in building low-carbon power stations, but in the massive electrification program that will be necessary, in retrofitting, in other words, making our existing building infrastructure, which we'll still be using for the next 20, 30, 40 years, to make that building infrastructure suitable for the 21st century. So you require much less energy to heat it or to cool it, and that is a much safer environment to be in as the climate continues to change, which it undoubtedly will. Even if we stopped emissions today, we'll see some ongoing climate change.
You have criticized the IPCC for constraining its policy advice to fit neatly within the current economic model. Can you explain? I mean, for some to have a landmark report like this is simply critical, because we live in a country in the United States where the president proudly denies climate change, calls it a Chinese hoax. And so to have any kind of report like this, but you're a critic of the report in some respects.
Well, certainly, whilst I think it is a really good report in trying to understand the impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade of warming, when it comes to what we have to do about it, I think, again, it runs scared of really being very honest. And given it's effectively a scientific report, I think our role as scientists and as academics is to tell it like it is, not to colour it or sweeten the pill to make it more attractive. So my comments here are that, and it's not just with this report, it's been repeatedly come out of the IPCC. So whilst we're quite direct and honest about the impact side, when it comes to what we have to do about this, we run scared. We don't want to scare the politicians or the public. We don't want to move away from this sort of the energy systems that we have today. So we always try to broadly sort of massage the status quo, so incremental changes, if you like. And what I'm saying is that actually, when you really look at the numbers behind the report, look at the numbers the science comes out with, then we're talking about a complete revolution in our energy system. And that is going to beg very fundamental questions about how we run our economies. And again, you can turn around and say, well, that seems just far too removed from the current economic system we have. But we have to remember it's only been, it's 10 years now since the banking crisis, and many parts of the world are still suffering the repercussions of that banking crisis. So the current economic framework has struggled within its own remit, if you like. So I think this has been a real opportunity, which we are now losing, to reshape that economy so it's an economy that's suitable for society, not a society that's suitable for the economy. And I think the policymakers, sort of the academics, have just run scared of this, of being honest about what our numbers tell us about the rates of change that we require, and how we have to move the productive capacity of our society from building second homes for professors or private jets or private yachts or large four-wheel drive cars, moving from that to building public transport, electrification, improved homes for everyone. So it's a shift of that productive capacity, the resources and the labour, from the, if you like, the luxury for the 20% to the essential low-carbon infrastructure for all of us.
Dr. Anderson, the effect of Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. We just had a segment on Brazil. The frontrunner, Jair Bolsonaro, who our guest called open fascist, extremely far right-wing candidate, has promised that he will pull out of the Paris Agreement as well and would abolish Brazil's Ministry of Environment, which environmentalists fear would lead to deforestation of the Amazon. Your thoughts on both Bolsonaro and Trump?
Well, they're clearly from a scientific perspective, and I would also argue probably from a moral perspective, they are completely out of tune with what our analysis is saying. I also think we have to be very careful when we see these extreme figures, and both of these, I think, are certainly extreme figures. We have to remember that they are a little bit of noise on the system. The general trend line is more recognition that climate change is a serious issue. Even the poll data in the States shows this. I've not seen data for Brazil, so I'm not sure. But so we are seeing climate change events, and people are thinking this is an important issue. Because some of our, perhaps not always the brightest people who are leading our countries can't understand that, or think that they have a political base they have to appeal to who will not want to hear that message. I think the rest of us should not run scared of them. We just have to redouble our efforts. And indeed, when President Trump decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement, which of course he can't do yet anyway, but plans to, then the Chinese and the French stepped forward and said, well, we will try and make some extra effort to compensate. And we also see in the US many mayors saying actually climate change is still an important issue. So the US is not a dictatorship. Trump cannot dictate what the population of the US is going to do. Of course, he is important and he is influential, but so are the mayors. So it is incumbent on the rest of us who are more informed by the science, and I would argue with a more reasoned, moral and progressive background to our analysis. It's up to us to redouble our efforts and make sure that we move in the right direction and not to run scared of the Trumps of this world. There are plenty of them. They will come and they will go. But the overall issue of climate change, the physics of climate change, is here to stay, regardless of the ephemeral whims of the occasional president.
And in this last minute, what does the future look like? How bad can things get if we proceed on this course?
Well, the way things are going at the moment, I think it is quite reasonable to think we are heading to about 4 degrees centigrade of warming across this century. That would be utterly devastating. Just remember the difference between now and an ice age is about 5 degrees. So we're talking about changes that would normally occur over probably tens of thousands of years, occurring over little more than 100 years. And 100 years in some respects sounds like a long time, but many of the people listening to this, their children will still be alive in 100 years, and certainly their grandchildren will be. 100 years is just tomorrow, really, in so many respects.
And what would the world look like?
What we do today locks in the infrastructure.
And what would the world look like?
We will be seeing far more famine, drought, floods, changes in food patterns. I think we'll probably start to see lots more tension within communities, and that means then a lot more tension between communities. So we see, we look at Syria. Syria clearly wasn't caused by climate change, but the 12 years of drought in that region was an exacerbating factor. And that's with just 1 degree of warming. As we head towards 4 degrees centigrade of warming, we're talking about breaking down many of the ecosystems of the world that pollinate our crops, that make our air clean for us. So this is a different planet from the one on which we live. And the chaos that will ensue will be bad for our species, for humans, but also, indeed, of course, for many other species around the planet. And that's why we have to do everything we can to hold to ideally 2 degrees centigrade, well, to hold for 2 degrees centigrade and ideally aim for 1.5. I think that's looking very challenging. So let's do everything we can to keep the temperature as low as possible.
Kevin Anderson, we want to thank you for joining us, the Zennström Professor in Climate Change Leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, Uppsala University, also Chair of Energy and Climate Change at Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester in Britain, where he's speaking to us now. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we will talk about nuclear weapons with the Representative Beatrice Finn of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Stay with us.
Mother Earth says, now take good care of me. Please do not hurt me. Hey, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. And Father Sky says, now take good care of me. Please do not hurt me. Hey, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh.
We are here by Sharon Birch. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with North Korea, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has just met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un on Sunday for nearly 3 hours in talks meant to further steps toward nuclear disarmament. Pompeo hailed the meeting in Pyongyang as a success, saying both sides were, quote, pretty close to agreeing to details for a second summit between Kim and President Donald Trump. He also told reporters Kim has agreed to let international inspectors into a North Korean missile engine test facility and a nuclear testing site where the country conducted its 6 nuclear tests. In May, North Korea said it had destroyed the testing site but did not allow outside experts to inspect the grounds. But Pompeo did not say Monday whether North Korea would allow inspectors to visit a site where the country produces fuel for nuclear weapons. We're joined right now by Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Beatrice Finn, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you in studio as you're about to give a major address at the New School tonight. Talk about the significance of these talks.
It's extremely encouraging in a way. Just a year ago, we had Donald Trump threaten to totally destroy the entire North Korean country with nuclear weapons on Twitter. So this is very positive steps. At the same time, there's still quite a lack of detail. This cannot be agreement just between two men. It has to bring in the international treaties, the international law, the international agencies. We have a system that can help with this. We have organizations, we have treaties. These talks have to be anchored in the law that exists. North Korea, for example, has to join the CTBT. The United States have to join the CTBT.
And explain what the CTBT is.
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, a treaty that bans all nuclear testing and has means to verify that. When we're talking about these inspections, for example, you open up the North Korean test site, that cannot be done just by North Korea and the United States and be vulnerable to the whims of these two leaders. It has to be we have to take this unique opportunity to make sure that these two countries join the international treaty that exists so that they can't back out in 3 months if things change.
Can you talk about the U.S. nuclear stockpile? How large is it?
It's very big. We have still around 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. Over 90% belongs to Russia and the United States. The U.S. has about 6,800 nuclear warheads. And out of those, around 1,800 are ready to be launched within minutes. I mean, one nuclear weapon in Hiroshima killed over 100,000 people. 1,800 of these are ready to be launched, authorized by the president himself, within minutes.
What do you think should happen to them?
They need to be dismantled and disarmed. We have this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is a unique development in the legal landscape around nuclear weapons. And it's time for the United States and the other 9 nuclear armed states to follow the global trend. We can no longer threaten to mass murder civilians as a way of providing security with ourselves. We need to start taking, instead of threatening to use them and increasing and modernizing these nuclear arsenals that the nuclear armed states are doing, we need to move to a situation where we reduce our reliance, take steps to disarm.
Explain what the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is.
Well, this is a huge accomplishment, sort of a radical change in the structure around nuclear weapons. We have not had a ban on nuclear weapons before. The way we ban chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions. We've had this kind of nuclear apartheid system where different rules apply to different countries. The most richest and powerful countries in the world have been allowed to have them, whereas the rest of the world were not allowed to have them. And we've just accepted that for 70 years. But this treaty changes that in a way. It was adopted last year at the UN General Assembly with over 120 countries. The majority of countries in the world support this treaty. And it prohibits all nuclear weapons for all countries. It doesn't give exception to some countries, but it looks at the weapon as a weapon. These weapons have indiscriminate, inhumane impact on civilians. They will be a violation of the laws of war. We have banned biological and chemical weapons. Of course, these weapons should be banned as well. And right now we're working to get this treaty to enter into force by getting 50 ratifications. And once it does that, it will be international law. And it will start to have an impact on also the nuclear armed states.
You know, we just talked about this landmark UN report on climate change. And the report attacks nuclear power as a key climate solution by promoting the notion that it risks nuclear weapons proliferation, which cause childhood leukemia, destroys the natural environment. The authors write, nuclear energy can increase the risk of proliferation, have negative environmental impacts, and have mixed effects for human health when replacing fossil fuels. Your thoughts?
Well, we focus on the weapon itself. There are similar technologies behind this, but in its essence, one is a source of energy, one is a weapon meant to mass murder people. So we try to keep these two separate. But of course, the kind of changes in climate change means that we have to think about this. And the technology around nuclear weapons, with the spread of nuclear energy around the world, is no longer advanced. If a country like North Korea can get nuclear weapons, then one of the poorest countries in the world, then anyone can do it. So we have to work with the normative change. It's not a matter of constraining the technological possibility, but we have to work on getting countries to not want nuclear weapons.
So a lot is made of President Trump's relationship with President Putin of Russia. What's happening when it comes to the competition around nuclear weapons? I mean, you have Trump in August signing a $716 billion military spending bill. Military spending bill. It included over $21 billion for nuclear weapons programs, including $65 million for a new submarine-launched low-yield nuclear weapon. That's just the U.S.
Yeah, we see this trend all over the nuclear armed states. This kind of going back to the Cold War a little bit, increasing the role of nuclear weapons, coming up with new missions, emphasizing nuclear weapons more in their security doctrines. And this is very dangerous because we also have a very rapidly changing security environment. It's not actually the Cold War anymore. We have regional conflict. We have things like cyber warfare, fully autonomous weapons on the horizon. Things are changing very quickly, and the decisions that were made in terms of deterrence theory are no longer applicable. We see an exponential growth of the risk of accidental use, misunderstandings, and the more countries behave like this, the more likely it is that we will see the use of nuclear weapons, intentionally or by mistake.
The U.S. pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal?
It's a disaster. I mean, it's a working deal. A result of a long negotiations process. It shows a disdain for diplomacy and peaceful solutions. The deal works. We have inspectors verifying that Iran is complying with this deal. But it shows this kind of zero-sum attitude to negotiations, that you have to dominate, you have to win everything, you have to humiliate the opponent in a negotiation. And that's an extremely dangerous attitude because that doesn't solve the problem. I mean, you can't do America first in nuclear weapons. It doesn't work like that. It's a global problem, they need global solution. And that's what we see with North Korea. These two countries can't solve this problem on their own. It has to be anchored in law, anchored in international institutions.
So what are you proposing now? And talk about the grassroots organizing that's going on around this.
In many ways, we see similar. I was listening to the climate change discussion you just had before. In many ways, very similar. We have to act now. Both climate change and nuclear weapons are the two existential threats to us. And we have to urgently act and not ignore this anymore. We have tools. We have international law. We have treaties. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it has to enter into force. Countries have to support it. If the government doesn't want to, we have local actions. For example, around the U.S., we have cities like Los Angeles, Baltimore stepping up, supporting this treaty. We have the state of California that supported a resolution on the TPNW just in August, and we see sort of people taking action. The fact that world leaders are going in the wrong way isn't always a sign that the world is going that way. I think that we have to also highlight the positive developments. The majority of countries in the world, by far, do not have nuclear weapons, do not want nuclear weapons, and want them gone. And I think that that's also where we have to put focus on, in a way, and emphasize that. In terms of the North Korea, the U.S. negotiations, we really have to look at how to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and we have to use the existing treaties.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we're going to do part 2 of our discussion posted online at democracynow.org. Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the organization. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.